Welcome to another edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series Tawara Otawai. I'm Chris Harrington, an amateur enthusiast for all things Byzantine. Today we're going to go back in time, nearly 2,000 years ago, to an ancient and complex infrastructure built on a water supply on the other side of the world. When the Emperor Constantine moved his capital from Rome to Byzantium, he renamed it Constantinople and set about making it militarily secure. The problem was that while it was a great defensive site, there wasn't a lot of water. And so the Eastern Roman emperors set about building a network of aqueducts and cisterns to pipe water from the Belgrade forest in Thrace to the city. They and the Islamic sultans who conquered them in 1453 created a magnificent water infrastructure. Today, when you visit Istanbul, the former Constantinople, this ancient water world is a big tourist attraction. The Basilica Cistern in Turkish Yerebatan and a nearby Theodosius Cistern pull the crowds into a world of underground pillars and dark, mysterious pools. With me to discuss this ancient wonder is Professor Jim Crow. He is the Emeritus Professor of Roman and Byzantine Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. Jim has done everything from excavating Hadrian's Wall to studying Roman forts on the Danube. He's also an expert in the water infrastructure of Istanbul. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Right, glad I can be here. Good to see you, Chris.
Now, the thing that I suppose the first connection I'd like to make is you worked on Hadrian's Wall, but Hadrian had a link with Istanbul, didn't he?
Yeah, it's very intriguing. In fact, there's a conference early in November, which is celebrating the birthday of Constantinople, because the city was founded in 324. So, of course, it's 1,700 years since the city was founded. And I'll be talking about the aqueduct of Hadrian, because that's a critical element in as the new city developed. Now, the issue is about the aqueduct of Hadrian is that we know about a significant number of other aqueducts in the Mediterranean world which were sponsored by Hadrian. He didn't just build walls. He built another one in Germany, not just one in Britain. So Hadrian's legacy is very important. But the interesting and slightly puzzling factor is that whereas it's very well documented amongst Roman sources, there's nothing about Constantinople. And the only one, or rather its predecessor, Byzantium, and the only references come from later Byzantine sources.
Where is Hadrian's aqueduct now inside Constantinople? It doesn't appear to be there if you're a tourist anyway.
Well, that's really a question of publicity, really, information. The Yerebatan Saray, which is the great Basilica Cistern, which you've already mentioned, which has just recently been restored by the Istanbul municipality. So I think it's terrific. I saw it last year. But that actually was the end of the aqueduct of Hadrian. We know that from Byzantine sources. We can't actually say this is the aqueduct of Hadrian, but at least two Byzantine sources are quite specific in saying that the aqueduct of Hadrian finished at that system. So what I think happened in the period before Constantine's foundation is that the water was brought from the area of the forest, what's called the Forest of Belgrade, which is about 30 kilometers to the northwest of the city in a series of forests, as the name implies. And everything in the Roman world had to work through gravity. Water was dragged along gradually through gravity. There were no pumps. There were sometimes siphons, but that's about as far as it goes.
Talking about the Basilica Cistern, it's not actually unique, is it? There's hundreds of these cisterns across Istanbul.
It's not unique, but it is remarkable. Insofar, there are something that we know of, 200, we did a project a few years ago working with Turkish archaeologists and British engineers, and we came up with a total number of about 230 known cisterns across the city, which is a large number. Other cities in the ancient world have, cisterns in the numbers of hundreds. What's important and distinctive And it differs, for instance, from ancient Rome. What's really critical about Constantinople is the size of some of the cisterns, like the Yerbatan. The Yerbatan is enormous. I mean, you can have a pop concert in it. It's vast. And on the outer fringes of the city, but within the 5th century Great Walls, the Theodosian land walls, are three huge open reservoirs, which are simply still existing as great sort of holes in the ground. And these were dug in the 5th century.
How many of these cisterns are in use, or are any in use now?
None of the cisterns are in use currently, except as restaurants or tourist venues, or one used to be used as a discotheque, and so on. And some of them had rather less palatable uses, which I won't mention online. So none of them are actually used for water storage, although interestingly enough, a project that we had, which finished a couple of years ago, when we were working with the main water authority in Istanbul. This was a project which was trying to look at the past, but also trying to think about the lessons from the past and how they can inform the present and the future management of water in this enormous city of Istanbul. It's got 20 million population or so. The water engineers got really interested. They weren't, although they lived in Istanbul, they weren't really familiar with the size of these cisterns. And one of the questions is, says, "Oh, can we use these again?" And then we said, "Well, probably it's going to be a bit tricky to do that." And the main thrust of that project has gone into a similar theme, which is to do with rainwater harvesting, rather than actually a large-scale storage. But of course, storage is an element of rainwater harvesting, as you'll be aware. So Byzantium itself was a medium-sized city, no different, let's say, than Pompeii. It needed water because the Romans liked to have baths, and the Romans liked more. They needed, in order to express civic identity, they needed water much more than the Greeks did. The Greeks did it in different ways, much more explicitly in temples and so forth. So the Romans needed water. So water was an absolute expression of civic identity. The facilities that the town authorities provided to the population and so on. So, but the aqueduct of Hadrian was satisfactory for that. But the new city extended, the peninsula of Istanbul is quite constricted. It's like a sort of triangle. And in order to extend the city, Constantine had to build on higher ground than was previously occupied in old Byzantium. And as I've already mentioned, the problem with water supply is that it's gravity fed. So if you have areas of the city which are at a much higher level than previously, you have to find a new water source. And so that's what happened after Constantine. Constantine's successor started it, Constantius II, and it was finished by a later emperor called Valens in the 370s. So, but this system was much, much longer, much more ambitious than anything else in the Roman world. Constantinople doesn't have a river, it has the sea. So there's potable water is in short supply, but if you have the aqueduct of Hadrian and a relatively small city, that's enough. But if you have a much bigger city, which is eventually become the capital of the Roman world, you need something much bigger. You need a lot more water, and you also need water to be able to source those areas at a higher elevation. So they were obliged, therefore, to look for new springs much further to the west of the city. So they went into the forests of the west of the city and they found the springs, and they created what is essentially the longest Roman water supply line. It's over 200 kilometers long. It's quite astonishing. And whenever I talk to civil engineers about how they actually implemented this system, they're astonished. It's like a sort of divine providence. Well, obviously, I don't think it was divine providence, but there's an application and a level of innovation and inventiveness which is not matched anywhere else in the Greco-Roman world.
How far did that hunt for water go, and how vulnerable was it? I seem to remember the Avars. Are they called the Avars? The Avars?
Yeah,
Cut that water supply in, I think, about 621, didn't they?
Yeah, there's the Great Siege of 626, which is the first time the city had really been properly. I mean, people had come up to the walls and said, "Oh God, they're big," and the Huns turned up and turned around. But the Avars are the first people who make a real effort to try and capture the city. It's a period of huge military and political crisis in the late Roman world. And they did, as far as we know, they cut one of the aqueducts. They didn't cut the aqueduct of Hadrian. They did cut the very long distance aqueduct. And of course, it's well known that aqueducts are sensitive to military attack. I mean, there's a very good example for when the Byzantines themselves, or late Romans, Byzantines, let's say in the 6th century, under Justinian's general Belisarius was besieging Rome. And there's evidence for one of the aqueducts being cut and being, the excavations have actually been able to demonstrate that the aqueduct was cut at about that period. So that's the Romans attacking Rome, if you like, because that's the Eastern Roman Empire attacking the Goths in Rome. So aqueducts were potentially vulnerable, but the cutting of the long-distance aqueduct, which was sometimes referred to in the text as the city's aqueduct, to differentiate it from the Hadrian aqueduct, was actually quite a significant event, because it wasn't restored until the 760s. So there's something like 150 years when it was not functioning. And so the city was obliged to rely simply on the Hadrianic aqueduct. But that's in the period of the 7th and 8th century, which is a sort of serious downturn. It's, what some people, I don't like the term particularly, but people refer to as the Dark Ages. And it's certainly a period of both political and ideological crisis across the Eastern Roman Empire.
So what happened in 1453? Did the water supply again get cut when the Turks laid siege to the city?
There's no evidence of that. I haven't read. I mean, obviously the literature relating to the siege of 1453 is very extensive, and there's no evidence that the Turks did cut that. And I found that quite surprising. But by that period, the population of the city had decreased significantly. At its highest point under Justinian, before the Justinianic plague, the population of the city was probably about 500,000. It then dropped down, and it's extremely difficult. I mean, these are guesstimates. I mean, they're not. I mean, people come up with figures, but we don't know what they really mean. We can't be confident of them. But I think the population of the city after the end of the 6th century really did decline significantly, possibly down to about 100 and 150,000. Now, going back to your question about the Ottomans. What happened in 1453? Well, essentially, what the Ottomans did was to see a rather sort of ramshackle, not particularly well maintained water system that was based primarily from the Forest of Belgrade, and to reinstate it. There's evidence that the first Sultan did that, Mehmet II, Bayezid to a lesser degree, and certainly Suleiman. And the great Ottoman architect, Suleiman's great architect, Sinan, there's an autobiography of Sinan, which actually talks very specifically about the old aqueduct channels of the infidel in the Forest of Belgrade were being rebuilt by the Ottomans. So there's a massive reconstruction, but essentially on the lines of what had previously existed.
So what is the difference between the Ottoman?
Well, the big difference is that if you go to the Forest of Belgrade today, you will see some massive Ottoman bridges, some of which were built by Sinan. The Marlova aqueduct, for instance, they're huge. For some reason, nobody else has really brought this up as a problem, but it puzzled me because I probably think more about aqueducts than most in Constantinople than other people do. They've got better things to do. But it always puzzled me that these enormous bridges, which are sort of on par with the greatest bridges outside of the city built by the Romans and, comparable to the Pont du Gard. We know that one or two of the bridges have foundations which are quite clearly Roman or Byzantine in date. There's two bridges that have got that. So some of the bridges are clearly rebuilds, but some of them, I think, are new bridges, but they're replacing a much more sinuous line as it goes around the hills, because basically the water channels follow the contours, and they drop gradually. over distance. So either you go up the line of a valley and then round it, and you have a channel which is perhaps 3 kilometers long, or you just cross the valley, in which you have a channel which is much shorter and is actually easier to maintain. So I think that's what the Ottomans are doing. But as I say, that's still a hypothesis. But I'm sure that's probably going to be the answer.
This raises an interesting question. I mean, this is incredibly precise surveying work over hundreds of kilometres. I mean, this is quite amazing to keep this gravity-fed water coming, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's, as I said earlier, that when I've talked to civil engineers, and I did work, not our most recent project, but the project before that, we worked with a group of engineers, water engineers and other engineers from Edinburgh. We had a funded project on that with 2 PhD students who did really interesting work, who were both engineers rather than archaeologists. And everybody's just astonished. But they could have only used the sort of standard Roman system of surveying. I think what it involved is it's very labor intensive, and it takes a long time. But if you're prepared to put in the time and the effort, obviously it can be achieved. It's a lesson to us all, if you don't need high tech surveying techniques. I often wonder, in Britain and also in Europe, in France, for instance, from the 17th and particularly the 18th century, before the introduction of the railways, we created a huge system of canals, which must have required something similar in terms of technology. But I think surveying instruments by the 18th century were probably more sophisticated than what the Romans had. The introduction of canals is not dissimilar to these very long distance water supplies.
We're reading your essay. You talk about the amount of rock, and I've always remember, I was quite impressed by this. This enormous amount of rock was required to build these basilicas, cisterns and aqueducts, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's actually the real amount of building material is not so much for the cisterns. Cisterns are basically just they're quarries. You dig the material out. There wasn't stone available for building. Well, there was some stone available for building in Constantinople, but that wouldn't have been particularly useful. And in fact, in Constantinople, the cisterns themselves are constructed. Very often, they're constructed of brick, which you can see in the Yerevan. The late Romans had a massive, just like old Rome had a massive brick industry. So Constantinople is very much a brick city, huge quantities of bricks up until the end of the 6th century. And so when you look at the cisterns, that's what's being used. Remember, it's not 200 kilometres as the crow flies from the city. It's 100 kilometres from the city. But it winds around all these hills through which it passes, and then there are tunnels. So it's stone for the covered channels, and the channels themselves are up to 2 meters high, 1 meter 50 wide, and they're quite, you can walk along them where they survive. And then there are the bridges, and some of the bridges are very large.
How much of, I'm thinking of the Medusa heads in the Basilica Cistern, but how much of this is recycled from one age to another age to another age?
The cisterns themselves are very interesting, and there's been that's one of the areas where there's always been an interest by what I might call classical archaeologists who like capitals and columns and buildings that look a bit fancy in Roman and Greek. And in the Yerevan, the Basilica Cistern, which is by a long way the largest of the covered cisterns, and it has a brick vaulted roof, but of course that brick vaulted roof is supported on this wonderful collection of columns. And the columns, some of the columns are reused, and as you mentioned, the Medusa's heads in the top southeastern corner of the cistern. And those are clearly reused. They're reused from probably from the 3rd century public space. But the majority of the columns are not reused in the Basilica Cistern, are not reused. They're actually from the quarries, but they're the ones that didn't quite pass muster. The quality control said, nah, not fit for purpose. We can't put that outside. Use that for something else. So there must have been a big pile of these somewhere, and they used those. And the same is true for the capitals. Some of the capitals in the Basilica Cistern are unfinished, But an awful lot of them are nearly finished. But again, they're the ones that didn't pass quality control. And so they were then reused in a structure which is most of the time invisible. It didn't have the advantages of pretty lighting that it does now. So there are these lovely engravings from the 19th century which show people in boats in the Basilica Cistern with candles, so with flickering light and shadows. And of course, I hope some of your listeners will have seen From Russia with Love. Sean Connery is taken into the Basilica Cistern by his Turkish guide, and they get into a small rowing boat, and they do the most extraordinary thing, which is to row across the Basilica Cistern. Unfortunately, there's not enough water in it now to do that. You might get a paddleboard, but that's about it. Across the Basilica Cistern, and then he puts a periscope up into what's allegedly the Russian consulate, which is actually on the other side of the Bosphorus, but never mind, we are dealing with Hollywood's notion of geography. But if you really want to, download From Russia with Love, and you get some of the best views of the Basilica Cistern that you can find before it was all restored and made safe and sound. So in terms of reused material, there is the reuse of material, and the city of Constantinople, through time, continued to reuse, to recycle. It was a great, in the period from late antiquity, by which I mean the end of the Roman world in the West, in the 6th, 7th centuries, and into the early medieval and into the medieval period, it's so much of the material is recycled. So the churches in the Middle Byzantine period in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries, they're built of brick, but they're built of bricks that were actually made in the 6th century. An awful lot of them are not new bricks, they're just recycling. So there's a huge amount of, it's a city which is very aware of the benefits of basically buildings fall down and they're able to reuse them. So it's a model for the modern world, actually.
What sort of lessons for the modern world could you possibly extract from this? It's such a magnificent system, and we're all fighting for infrastructure money. What do you take out of this?
It's quite, I think I mentioned before with this project, we had the last big project, which was finished 18 months ago, where we were working with water engineers in Istanbul, and we were working with the municipality and to implement new systems. So we had sociologists and political scientists who were Turkish, and then we had some of the team who'd worked on the water engineering project, and we were trying to come up with ideas of how far we could use the past to inform the present and the future. I don't believe you can get lessons, but you can get ideas, and I think the experience of the past can help people in the present and the future sort of understand how best to proceed. What I think it does show is that there is a sort of recognition of that water needs to be managed at either a state level or a major municipal level, or later on slightly differently, because the church becomes much more involved in actually management on a more local level about the distribution of water in Constantinople. But basically, it remains a public system. Water is not privatized in Constantinople. In order to pay for water, you have to be rich and you want to have your own private baths, in which case there is legislation which says, in which case you need to pay for water. But otherwise, water is free at the point of delivery at all times. And it is also in the Ottoman system. It's only later on we see the introduction of modernity in the 19th century when private water comes into Istanbul. So I think that's one of the lessons, this idea that water is a commodity which is always to be free for people to use. And that's, I think, a very important lesson for our own world when we live in a world where water is seen as a commodity which can be sold. And then, of course, in some ways, when water becomes scarce, it's important that you can have some control over it, but you have to manage that control very carefully. So I think it's lessons like water, the availability of water, the significance of water for large urban areas. And I think, I mean, we're familiar with that today, that many cities have real challenges One other lesson about Constantinople is that it is always complex, and it's dealing with that complexity which enables cities satisfactorily to survive and its citizens to flourish.
Jim, thank you very, very much. And thanks everybody for listening.